You've heard the claim. It's the absolute bedrock of the Christian faith. The one belief they say changes everything. The resurrection of Jesus is one of the best attested facts in history. They'll tell you it's more certain than the assassination of Julius Caesar, more historically reliable than the campaigns of Alexander the Great. It's an audacious claim, bold, and as we're about to see, it's also complete and utter nonsense. Hey everyone, Farid here, and welcome to the Rational Farid. On this channel, we take a flamethrower of reason to claims that hide in the shadows of faith, and today we are aiming it squarely at the central myth of Christianity. The purpose of this video is simple: to rationally examine the so-called evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and to demonstrate why it belongs not in a history book, but on the shelf next to the Epic of Gilgamesh and the myths of Osiris. We're going to peel back the layers of this supposed second life of Jesus and see just how flimsy the evidence truly is. First, we'll dismantle the pillars of the apologetic case: the empty tomb, the so-called eyewitness accounts, and the claim that the disciples wouldn't die for a lie. Then, we'll expose the resurrection story for what it is by placing it in its proper context, alongside the countless other dying and rising gods and divine ascension, myths that were all the rage in the ancient world. And finally, we'll strike at the core of the problem: the fictional nature of the God said to have performed the miracle in the first place. This isn't about mockery. This is about intellectual honesty. So stick around, because if you're looking for answers that make sense in this universe, you're in exactly the right place. Let's get into it. All right. Before we dive into the weeds of empty tombs and alleged eyewitnesses, we need to establish the rules of the game. We need a rational framework. And the most fundamental rule of critical thinking, the one that should be tattooed on the inside of every skeptic's eyelids, is this: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If I tell you I had eggs for breakfast, you don't need much evidence. It's a boring, ordinary claim. You'll probably just take my word for it. But if I tell you a 20-foot-tall invisible dragon made me eggs for breakfast, well, you're going to need a bit more than just my word. You're going to need some extraordinary proof. Now, let's consider the claim on the table today: that a human being, after being medically dead for 3 days, physically returned to life. This isn't just an extraordinary claim. It's arguably one of the most extraordinary claims anyone can make. Think about it. Our entire collective understanding of biology, chemistry, and physics tells us, without exception, that once the biological processes of a complex organism like a human being cease, they do not spontaneously restart. Once you're dead, you're dead. We have no verifiable real-world analogy for a fully deceased person physically rising from death. Not one. Zero. There are no peer-reviewed papers on it. There are no documented cases in modern hospitals. It stands in direct opposition to the fundamental laws of nature as we know them. So where do we find stories of people coming back from the dead? Where is the genre for that? You find it here. In myths, in legends, and in fairy tales. That is the only place these stories exist. So right off the bat, we're faced with a choice. Do we treat the resurrection of Jesus as a unique historical outlier that magically gets to bypass the laws of nature, or do we analyze it within the only genre it actually fits into? If it looks like a myth, sounds like a myth, and shares its key elements with other myths, it's probably a myth. With that framework in mind, let's look at the ordinary evidence they present for this most extraordinary of claims. So we've established the ground rule. An extraordinary claim like a resurrection requires truly extraordinary evidence. The problem for Christian apologists is that the evidence they have is painfully, almost laughably ordinary. In fact, it's not even evidence in a historical sense. It's a collection of literary claims, logical fallacies, and arguments from emotion. Let's put on our critical thinking hats and dismantle their case, pillar by rotten pillar. The first pillar they try to build is called multiple attestation. The idea is that the resurrection must be true because it was witnessed by numerous people and groups. Peter, the 12 disciples, 500 people at once, and so on. Sounds impressive, right? But let's pull back the curtain. Let's get real and ask the basic questions a first-year journalism student would ask. Who are these people? Are they named impartial sources? Do their stories even agree? The answer is a resounding no. The harsh reality is that the New Testament accounts, our only sources for this, were, as the saying goes, written by authors unknown, at places unknown, at a date unknown. And what about these supposed witnesses, the heroes of the story? Guess what? The 12 disciples and the Apostle Paul are nowhere to be found in any secular history of the time. No Roman, Greek, or even non-Christian Jewish writer from the first century bothered to mention them, let alone any radical change in their behavior, from cowards to martyrs. For the historical record, they are ghosts. Even worse for the apologist, the multiple sources aren't multiple sources at all. When we look at the Gospels, biblical scholars are in near universal agreement on the pattern. Mark was written first, around the year 70. That's a full 40 years after Jesus supposedly died. And Matthew and Luke? They didn't have independent sources for the Passion narrative. They just copied from Mark, changing details and adding their own theological spin. We are talking about multiple independent witnesses here. We're talking about later writers elaborating on an earlier story. That's not multiple attestation. That's called literary development. It's how legends grow. Pillar 1 collapses. Alright, next. This one is the emotional trump card. Apologists love to play the persecution and martyrdom card. They lean in close and say, the disciples wouldn't die for a lie. And you know what? I agree with them on one thing. I don't think the early Christians were lying. I think they sincerely believed what they were preaching. But here's the crucial point they always seem to miss. Sincere belief does not make something true. 1997, Marshall Applewhite and 38 members of the Heaven's Gate UFO cult sincerely believed a spaceship was hiding behind the Hale-Bopp comet, and they killed themselves to reach it. They died for a lie. 2021, Ashley Babbitt sincerely believed the 2020 U.S. election was being stolen and was killed while storming the Capitol. She died for a lie. 7th century, Sumayya bint Qabat, the first martyr of Islam, sincerely believed in the revelations of Muhammad and was tortured to death for her faith. 19th century, early Mormons sincerely believed Joseph Smith translated golden plates given to him by an angel and faced extermination orders and massacres for it. People die for sincerely held beliefs all the time, often for beliefs that are demonstrably false. So the disciples' willingness to suffer proves their sincerity, yes, but it proves absolutely nothing about whether a man actually rose from the dead. And what exactly was this early belief they were dying for? The modern image is of Jesus popping out of the tomb and hanging out for 40 days, eating fish sandwiches. But the earliest Christian belief, the one we find in our earliest writer, Paul, wasn't about a resuscitated corpse. It was about Jesus being exalted to heaven as a divine being. He was raised and lifted up and highly exalted. How do you disprove that someone was taken up into heaven? You can't. It's a non-falsifiable spiritual claim. And the whole waves of persecution narrative, it's largely overblown. The 3rd century church father Origen, writing about the period before him, admitted that the number of Christian martyrs had been very few and can be easily counted. This argument from martyrdom isn't evidence for the resurrection. It's evidence of human psychology and the power of conviction, a power we see in countless other religions. Pillar 2. Dust. Next up, the centerpiece of the Easter story, the empty tomb. The argument goes that the tomb was found vacant, and if Jesus wasn't resurrected, the authorities would have just rolled out the body and shut the whole movement down. It sounds like a Loctite case, until you apply the slightest bit of critical scrutiny. First, the timeline. This story of women finding an empty tomb doesn't appear in our earliest sources, like Paul. It shows up for the first time in the Gospel of Mark, written 40 years after the fact. Paul's early creed in 1 Corinthians 15 simply says Jesus was buried. It doesn't specify a tomb, let alone an empty one. For most non-elite Jews of the period, like Jesus likely was, burial wasn't in a nice, identifiable family tomb. It was often in unmarked trench graves for common criminals. But let's grant them the tomb for a moment. The first public preaching of the resurrection happened at Pentecost, 50 days later. Do you know what happens to a corpse in a hot climate over 50 days? It becomes skeletonized, unrecognizable. The idea that authorities could have produced an identifiable body to quell the movement is simply unrealistic and anachronistic. But what about the Jewish leaders claiming the body was stolen? Apologists cry, that proves the tomb was empty. No, it doesn't. This was just rhetorical sparring. If the grave's location was unknown or the body was unidentifiable, what's the easiest counter-argument to a resurrection claim? Accusing them of hiding the body. It's a classic polemic, not a historical concession. Now, here's the real kicker. The missing body and the empty tomb is a classic, bog-standard motif in ancient myths about heroes and gods. When Romulus, the founder of Rome, vanished, they couldn't find the least part of his body, nor any remnant of his clothes, and he was declared a god. When Heracles' bones couldn't be found on his funeral pyre, it was assumed he had passed from among men into the company of the gods. The philosopher Aristeas supposedly died in a shop, but when his friends came to get the body, there was no Aristeas there, dead or alive. And a messenger later reported meeting him on the road. This isn't a coincidence. The empty tomb is a mimetic signal. It's a literary cue that tells the ancient reader exactly what kind of story this is. Not history, but a tale of apotheosis, of a hero becoming a god. The empty tomb doesn't prove resurrection. It proves the story is a legend. Pillar 3 crumbles. So far, we've seen that every single piece of evidence for the resurrection is flimsy, late, better explained by literary development or a standard feature of ancient mythology. But now, we move beyond the flimsy evidence to the core of the problem, because even if we were to grant every single one of their points, the anonymous sources, the martyrdom, the legendary empty tomb. The resurrection hypothesis still fails spectacularly for three fundamental reasons. First, apologists love to pull out a philosophical tool they barely understand. Occam's razor. They claim that Jesus' literal bodily resurrection is the simplest explanation that accounts for the data. This is a profound, almost comical misuse of the principle. If simplicity was our only guide, if we just picked the explanation that requires the fewest steps without any regard for plausibility, then we'd have to believe that Romulus, Asclepius, and the angel Moroni really appeared to people too. In those stories, a supernatural appearance is also the simplest explanation for the claims being made. The real Occam's razor demands explanations that are not just simple, but also plausible, well-evidenced, and most importantly, correspond to our background knowledge of how the universe actually works. What's a more plausible, evidence-based explanation for the belief in a resurrection? A violation of all known laws of physics and biology, performed by a supernatural agent for which there is no evidence, or cognitive dissonance in a failed apocalyptic movement, a group of zealous followers who'd given up everything for a Messiah who got himself killed, desperately needing to believe it wasn't all for nothing. Add in grief-induced visions, cultural expectations of apotheosis, and stories that grow in the telling over decades. One of these explanations requires us to throw out all of science. The other is a well-documented, purely naturalistic human phenomenon. Occam's razor doesn't support the resurrection. It cuts its throat. But now we come to the showstopper. The argument that single-handedly vaporizes the entire resurrection hypothesis. The New Testament is explicit about one thing. Jesus didn't raise himself. God raised Jesus from the dead. That is the claim, and this God is none other than Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Here is the monumental, inescapable problem. The biblical Yahweh is a fictional character. Biblical scholarship and archaeology have made it abundantly clear. Yahweh began his life as a minor Canaanite storm and warrior god, part of a larger pantheon, and was very much like his contemporary Baal. He was depicted with a voice of thunder, hurling lightning, riding on the clouds. Crucially, this god was deeply anthropomorphic. The Bible describes him with a human form, with eyes, ears, a mouth, hands, feet, and yes, even a backside that he shows to Moses. The sophisticated, transcendent, invisible, incorporeal God that modern theologians and philosophers talk about, that's a later abstraction. It was, as one scholar put it, assembled over the course of 2,000 years from selected scraps of ancient Jewish mysticism, Greek philosophy, Christian doctrine. This was a cultural and philosophical upgrade, an attempt to make this ancient Levantine tribal deity seem more plausible in the sophisticated Greco-Roman world. But here's the bottom line. A fictional character, born out of ancient myth and edited over centuries, cannot do anything in the real world. To say that Yahweh raised Jesus from the dead is as meaningless as saying Papa Smurf raised Jesus from the dead. The resurrection hypothesis fails because its primary agent, the magical being who supposedly did the magic, is an imaginary entity. Game over. And if, after all that, you still have a shred of doubt, there's one final glaring problem that comes from the Bible itself, the failed prophecy of Jesus' imminent return. The New Testament is absolutely explicit on this. Jesus told his own disciples, and I quote, "Truly I tell you, Some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Matthew 16:28. The Apostle Paul was so convinced it would happen in his lifetime that he wrote to the Thessalonians, quote, "We who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air." 1 Thessalonians 4:17. Well, newsflash, that didn't happen. It's been 2,000 years. The apostles are long dead. Paul is long dead. Everyone who was standing there is long dead. Jesus remains relegated to an unseen realm, just like Romulus, Heracles, and every other deified hero of myth. When a prophecy fails so spectacularly, the belief system has two choices: die or adapt to make itself unfalsifiable. The original, clear, literal meaning gets reinterpreted, delayed, or spiritualized away. It's a classic move, the last resort of a failed belief system desperate to protect itself in the face of cold, hard, contradictory evidence. The resurrection story is propped up by logical fallacies. Its primary agent is a work of fiction, and its promised conclusion was a catastrophic failure. So the evidence for the resurrection has crumbled. The core premises of the story, from its logic to its lead character, God, have collapsed. But if there were any doubt left, this next section is where we put the final nail in the coffin. Because Christianity didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was born into a world that was already saturated with stories of dying gods, rising saviors, and ascended heroes. To an audience in the ancient Mediterranean, the story of Jesus wouldn't have sounded like a unique historical report. It would have sounded strikingly, profoundly familiar. Let's start with a concept from comparative mythology that apologists absolutely hate: the dying and rising God. Now, to be fair to the scholarship, academics have debated the exact boundaries of this category for years. They've critiqued early scholars like James George Frazer for painting with too broad a brush. But let's not get lost in academic weeds. The core pattern is undeniable and widespread. A divine being who experiences death or a descent into the underworld is mourned and then returns to life, often bringing renewal and salvation. This motif was everywhere, and it's much, much older than Jesus. Meet Osiris from ancient Egypt. He is the original gangster of resurrection, predating Jesus by thousands of years. He is betrayed, killed, dismembered by his brother Set, and then resurrected bodily by his wife Isis. His return brings back the crops and floods the Nile, symbolizing new life for all of Egypt. And get this, ancient Egyptian rituals involved the symbolic consumption of his body and blood in the form of bread and beer to share in his immortality. Sound familiar? Then there's Attis from Phrygia in modern-day Turkey. He dies under a pine tree. His spring festival involved a ritual of wood-bearers carrying a tree trunk to which an effigy of him was pinned. He was mourned and then celebrated as resurrected on the day of joy. A god, associated with a tree, who dies and comes back in the spring. How about Adonis, who was worshipped all over the Semitic and Greek world? He's a beautiful young god killed by a boar, mourned by the goddess Aphrodite, and his resurrection was linked to the sprouting of plants in the spring. There's even a river in Lebanon that would turn red every spring from mineral deposits, and the locals said it was the annual bleeding of Adonis's wounds. And the list goes on. There was Melkart in Phoenicia, Dionysus in Greece, and the Babylonians had Tammuz, a god whose death was mourned so widely that the practice is even mentioned by the prophet Ezekiel in the Hebrew Bible. These are not identical, carbon copy stories, but the theme, the divine Savior who dies, is mourned, and returns to life, bringing hope and renewal, is an ancient and powerful mytheme that was thick in the cultural air the first Christians breathed. But it gets even more specific and even more damning, because beyond the dying and rising pattern, there was an even more common concept: divine translation, or apotheosis. This isn't just about resuscitation, coming back to life for a bit. This is the story of a great hero or ruler being taken from the earthly realm to a divine realm, achieving an elevated, godly status, and continuing to exist as a powerful heavenly being. This was the A-list celebrity story of the ancient world. And who got this treatment? Sons of gods, like Heracles, the son of Zeus. He suffers, dies on a funeral pyre, and then ascends to Mount Olympus to become a full-fledged god. And as the myths tell it, he even continues to procreate up there, which tells you that his ascended body was seen as very much a physical, functional thing, much like the spiritual body Paul talks about. Kings and rulers. This was huge. Romulus, the founder of Rome, disappeared in a storm. His body was never found. An empty tomb, if you will. He later appeared to a man named Proculus Julius, declaring he was now the god Quirinus, and giving instructions for his worship. This story became a powerful propaganda tool, used to justify the deification of later emperors like Caesar Augustus, who was also said to have ascended to the heavens after his death. Even virtuous or extraordinary people could get the golden ticket. We have tales of people disappearing from battlefields or being taken into rivers, only to be reckoned among the number of the gods. And these apotheosis stories share a checklist of tropes that should sound very familiar. A disappearance of the body, the empty tomb serving as the signal of divine translation, post-ascension appearances to followers, the giving of a new divine name or title, like Jesus being called Lord, and the establishment of a cult to worship them. This idea was so real to people that they even tried to fake it. The philosopher Empedocles supposedly jumped into Mount Etna, and Alexander the Great considered jumping into the Euphrates River, all so their bodies would disappear, and people would believe they had ascended. Roman imperial funerals even staged it. They would hide the real body, burn a wax effigy of the emperor, and release an eagle from the pyre at the last moment to symbolize his soul flying to the heavens. So what is the story of Jesus? It is a textbook case of Greco-Roman apotheosis. The major difference is that Christianity democratized the concept. It took this special honor, once reserved for the sons of gods and all-powerful emperors, and made it available to everyone. Through faith and initiation into the Christian cult, you too could share in the divine translation of your Savior. It was a brilliant marketing move, but it was not history. It was mythology, adapted for a new audience. So after all that, where do we stand? We've journeyed through the evidence, the logic, and the mythology. Let's recap what we found. We've seen that the claim of multiple attestation is an illusion, based on anonymous authors copying from a single late source. We've seen that the martyrdom argument proves sincerity but not truth, as people throughout history have died for all sorts of demonstrably false beliefs. We've seen that the empty tomb is not a historical fact, but a classic mythological trope used in countless ancient tales of gods and heroes. We've seen that the apologetic excuse that it was too early for myth is historically naive, as legends are known to develop with lightning speed in zealous, apocalyptic movements. We've seen that the resurrection hypothesis rests on the actions of a fictional deity, the evolved tribal storm god Yahweh, and is fatally undermined by its own failed prophecy of an imminent return. And finally, we've seen that the entire narrative, far from being unique, fits perfectly into the well-established ancient genres of the dying and rising god and the divine apotheosis of a hero. When you strip away the faith, the tradition, and the emotional appeals, the most rational, evidence-based, and intellectually honest conclusion is this: Jesus of Nazareth is dead. If he existed, he died, and he stayed dead. His story follows the same trajectory as countless other revered figures from antiquity, whose followers, out of grief and devotion, relegated them to an unseen realm and spun tales of their divinity. Jesus has simply joined the pantheon of mythological saviors like Osiris, Attis, and Romulus. Now, I want to be clear. This isn't about taking away anyone's toys to play with. I understand that myths can be powerful. They can be beautiful, inspiring, and contain deep moral and psychological truths about the human condition. I have no argument with someone who finds personal meaning in the story of Jesus. The problem starts, and it is a serious problem, when that myth is presented as literal historical fact, when it's used as a weapon to demand belief, to shut down inquiry, and to claim a unique supernatural authority over others. That is when we, as rational thinkers, have a duty to push back and demand evidence. And for the resurrection, the evidence simply isn't there. So that's it for this deep dive. If you found this video insightful and it helped you think more critically, do me a favor and hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe to the Rational Farid and ring that bell so you don't miss our future investigations into the myths and realities that shape our world. And most importantly, share this video. Let's get these ideas out there and spark more rational conversations. Because here, we're all about one thing: seeking the truth, whatever that may be. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.